Hello, and welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. I'm Chris McCurry.
And I'm Emma Waddington, and today we're delighted to be joined by Tamara Hubbard, a licensed clinical professional counselor who specializes in something most of us have never thought of, the psychological impact of living with food allergies. Tamara is the creator of the internationally recognized Food Allergy Counselor Directory, host of the Exploring Food Allergy Families podcast, and she's been featured everywhere from Forbes to NPR for her groundbreaking work. But here's what makes Tamara's work so relevant to all of us. She's discovered that food allergies create the perfect storm for anxiety. Think about it. You literally cannot eliminate all risk. You have to eat multiple times a day, and one mistake could be life-threatening. It's like anxiety's worst nightmare and ultimate teaching tool all rolled into one. Her new book, May Contain Anxiety, Managing the Overwhelm of Parenting Children with Food Allergy, comes out September 30th. And it explores how families can move from being controlled by their fears to living fully despite real, unavoidable risks. What she's learned working with these families offers profound insights for anyone struggling with anxiety, parenting fears, or the illusion that we can control our way to safety. Tamara has been named one of the top 100 women in food allergies. She's an allied health member of major allergy organizations, and most importantly, she understands that behind every medical diagnosis is a human story about fear, courage, and learning to live with uncertainty. Welcome, Tamara.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Very happy to have you.
Yes, it's a real delight. I'm really impressed with everything you've already done, and I'm so excited to get my hands on your new book. So perhaps we can get started with just talking to listeners about life with a food allergy, because I think most of us probably don't understand it and don't realize how common it is. I was quite surprised to hear some of the stats that you shared.
Yeah, here in the States, I think current stats are 1 in 13 kids. That's an average of 2 per classroom. But food allergies are not just impacting kids. Adults have food allergies as well, either from childhood or they may develop food allergies as adults. I think the current stats are 1 in 10 here in the States. But living with food allergies makes living more complicated, as you said in your intro, right? There's food all day, every day in almost everything that we do, social, school, work things. And so it's navigating these what our mind tells us, very dangerous and threatening opportunities at all corners of the day, all day, every day. And you can imagine that can be pretty exhausting over time.
Yeah, that would be. It's like death lurks everywhere.
Yeah. And, not every allergic reaction is life-threatening. I think that's an important distinction to make on the onset of our conversation, is that if somebody has a food allergy, and I'll define that a little more here first, a food allergy is not the same as an intolerance or sensitivity where it might just make your body feel uncomfortable. But a food allergy is essentially when the body misinterprets a food protein as something dangerous, and it goes into action to help you and save yourself from that food, from that protein that is deemed dangerous. So it's the body, the immune system working faulty is basically what it is. And so there's a lot of factors that go into what kind of allergic reaction you might have, from is it ingestion versus touching? How much did you ingest? What were you doing? Were you active when you ingested it? An allergic reaction can be, one bodily symptom, or it could be multiple bodily symptoms moving into what we call anaphylaxis, which is a much more severe allergic reaction. And that can happen, anaphylaxis can happen from food, from bee stings, from medication as well. It's not just food.
Sounds terrifying. I was also wondering, as you were describing some of the reactions, how do people find out they have a food allergy? It sounds like it could potentially have been a really terrifying first experience as well.
Yeah, a lot of times there's some trauma associated with the first allergic reaction that then leads to the diagnosis after going to the doctor and having, the workups done and a history taken about what you were eating and what was happening. It can be very terrifying. I know for my son, my younger son has a food allergy. And so that's what got me into this work. I was a marriage and family therapist doing other work, and then my son was diagnosed. And after I managed to cope with the diagnosis myself and get to sort of a more level foundational ground. Let me start that over. After I got myself to a place where I felt like I was managing things well, I decided I wanted to focus on it clinically. And so, yeah, there absolutely can be trauma associated with that first allergic reaction. And again, it's oftentimes we don't know we have that food allergy until we've had that allergic reaction.
Is it heritable?
So there can be a hereditary component to it, but it's not linear. So food allergies, everyone wants to know what causes it, right? Parents often feel guilty and blame themselves, the blame game for their child's food allergy, but it's really not that linear. It's a mix of things, everything from epigenetics, our genes changing over time, hygiene. There's a hygiene hypothesis. We're much more cleaner. We're much more clean. We're not outside getting dirty as much. There's a microbiome component to it too. So there's a lot of components to it. It's not linear. Parents who have food allergies, it's not automatic that their kids will have food allergies. Same thing if an older sibling has a food allergy, it's not a guarantee that a subsequent sibling would have food allergies. But there can be a hereditary component. It's just much more complex than meets the eye.
Have there been twin studies?
I'm actually not sure about that. There have been sibling studies where they've looked at the percentage, and it's much lower percentage from what I remember than our mind would like to think of siblings who have food allergies and then subsequent siblings. But I actually don't know about the twin study thing. There's got to be some out there. I just haven't read about them yet.
Curious. We'll look into that.
It's interesting though. Now I'm going to go and try to look or ask some of my friends who are in research.
And I was just thinking it would be helpful for me and for listeners to get an idea of what it's like if you get diagnosed or a family, your child gets diagnosed, the impulse must be to control everything. Like that fear must be overwhelming, especially if it's such a significant allergy where, that initial, what would we say, contamination led to a really severe reaction. I can imagine that sort of what we talk about in the podcast sometimes, that amygdala hijack would have been really, really strong and will start to control or want to attempt to control everything. What does that look like in their worlds or even in your world? Because you've been there.
Yeah. And I'll add in, it's not always just one food allergy. Sometimes families are managing multiple food allergies, right? And multiple food allergies, and with multiple children managing multiple food allergies, or parents managing food allergies as well, right? So, and that every extra food allergy we add sort of complicates and makes things even harder to manage. So I'll just put that out there too. It's not just one to manage sometimes for families. Yeah, the instinct when we feel anxious and overwhelmed by living with food allergies is, as you said, try to control everything. And unfortunately, we can't control everything all the time. I know for myself, when my son was diagnosed, that is exactly what I wanted to do, right? I developed very rigid routines, very rigid protocols and rules. And that's not to say that routines and protocols and rules aren't helpful. They absolutely are helpful and needed in managing life with food allergies. That's what helps keep us safe. But we also have to be mindful of, do these rigid protocols and rules and routines keep us from living a full life? And are we avoiding things beyond what's medically necessary just to calm our anxious mind or the anxious thoughts we have? And we can tend to overestimate risk and then underestimate our ability to safely navigate a situation just based on how anxious and overwhelmed we feel and that perceived lack of control over everything.
And it's not just a perceived control.
Right. So that's one of the things I address in my book. And I'm very careful to say many times in the book, I'm not a doctor. I'm a licensed therapist. So I help guide families to have important conversations with their healthcare team to get the right information that's specific to them. But one of the things that is very important when you're living with a food allergy or parenting a child with food allergy is learning how to determine perceived versus actual risk. And beyond that, the level of risk, right? So our mind wants us to think in absolutes. Everything is either totally safe or totally unsafe, totally risky or totally totally not risky. Unfortunately, there's a lot of gray in life. And so there may be experiences that, are not 100% risk-free or very, totally safe, but they're experiences that we may say we can do safely enough in order to bring value into our lives. So one example would be traveling, right? My husband is from England, and so we have a whole side of the family that lives over there. And immediately when my son was diagnosed, was like, yeah, okay, it's been great. We're not going over there anymore. That's what my mind told me, because the fear of flying and traveling and being in another country felt so overwhelming. However, then I had to work through to get factual information with our allergist to make sure, how can we do this safely? It's not a don't do it. It's, can we do it safely? It's a question of, can we? And if so, how? Put into the practice those protocols. And then the hardest part is actually doing the uncomfortable thing, like getting on the plane, like traveling, and trusting, that the information that our allergist told us is accurate, and we have the protocols we need, and we have our emergency action plan, and we have our epinephrine. But that was a values thing. And I talk about this in my book. Allergy families tend to mainly focus on safety and Allergy families tend to focus only or primarily on safety and protection, the values of safety and protection. And while those always remain top and very important and priority, it is important to also focus on other values in addition to safety, like connection, independence for our kids, growing independence, being curious, whatever values are important to you in addition to staying safe.
Well, I can imagine that some of these safety protocols and procedures sort of take on a life of their own and almost start developing superstitious behaviors that may be completely unrelated to the safety of the child or the adult. But in our minds, we're always looking for connections and associations. And things could probably spin out pretty quickly.
Very easily. Again, our mind wants, I use the analogy of Legos, or the metaphor of Legos, that, we may be able to put a bunch of pieces together, but for that particular kit that we're putting together, those two pieces we put together don't make the most sense for that picture. And so what I mean by that is that, our mind, when we're living with food allergies, anytime it feels anxious or we have an anxious what if thought, we can easily say, oh, that means something is completely unsafe or it's not safe to be doing. When in reality, the meaning may not be about safety. It may be safe enough to do. It may still be uncomfortable, but we might be anxious because it's new. We haven't practiced stepping outside of our comfort zone. We don't really know the outcome, but it's still safe enough to be doing. And I will say, again, that goes back to having really important conversations with allergists and healthcare teams. Is each individual and family managing food allergies needs to have conversations with their healthcare team to determine, with their set of allergies and their allergic profile, what is safe and unsafe. There are some standard facts out there that allergists will give, but then how does that apply to the way that family wants to live, the things that are important to them to be doing? And have conversations about how can we stay safe while doing these important things.
So those are very important conversations to have, and probably quite in-depth conversations.
And they don't always happen, unfortunately, because appointments are quick and we might only see our allergist once a year. So I'm always encouraging families to reach back out to their healthcare team and ask these questions. If there's something on their mind, if there's something they're wondering about, especially pertaining to safety, and they're spending hours online trying to get that information, or they're avoiding things just because they're feeling anxious rather than knowing if they need to be avoiding it for medical purposes, for safety purposes, for their child or their family, that's automatically when I say, please reach out to your healthcare team and have that important conversation. Schedule an appointment to have a consultation appointment, or just send a MyChart message.
So to be a strong advocate for your child and for your family.
100%. 100%.
Be a squeaky wheel.
Yeah, I call it being an empowered patient or, like you said, an advocate. And oftentimes we have to do that because we may not be having, a lot of times we're not having these sort of quality of life focused conversations in our allergy and healthcare appointments in general, but it's simply because of time. There's so much to cover in such a short period of time. But I encourage people not to feel like they're pestering their healthcare team if they're asking questions that are keeping them up at night or are impacting how they're living their lives.
Come in with a list.
Yes, yes, I do encourage that. Yeah.
This is so important, isn't it, to really be able to distinguish the information that you need to live more fully, and how that what you talked about is this idea that you mentioned in a previous conversation I heard that I loved, is that inevitably, right, safety will feel like it trumps everything. But you want to know how to have safety and live fully, right? Not just safety or living fully. And yes, requires, and especially in this context with food allergies, a certain amount of information. But like with other anxieties, this is why I find this parallel with food allergies such an important one, because there's ultimately nothing scarier than death, right? That's going to
Yeah.
really trigger anxiety and the desire to control. But a lot of anxiety comes with this fear of, catastrophic outcomes. Like if we think of, anxiety around, flying or the end of a relationship, or, there's always a worst case scenario. This one is particularly worst case. This is why it's so useful for our listeners to think about how on earth, if we can learn to navigate and live fully with a food allergy, we can learn to navigate and live fully with many other conditions and many other thoughts and feelings. So I think this conversation is a beautiful bridge for a lot of our listeners who may not have food allergies, but who may struggle with anxiety, to see that you really can live fully, even when things are really, really scary.
You can. And it's not to say it's easy when you're just focused on safety or when we're primarily focused on safety, which we always will be when managing food allergies. It's just a fact, right? But some of the things that I encourage parents and families to do to help them find that balance between safety and living fully is one of the things you already mentioned is switching from an or mindset to an and mindset, right? So how can we go out to eat safely and have fun while eating out as a family? Instead of, can we go out to eat, or we can't go out to eat because it's unsafe, automatically assuming things are unsafe just because they make us feel anxious, right? So the other thing is to notice things in your life that categories you're automatically avoiding because of fear and anxiety, and go back to having that deeper conversation with your healthcare team on, do I need to be avoiding these things, or am I avoiding it to calm my own anxiety? So it's determining whether it's anxiety management that you're after, or it is needing to be avoided for safety purposes. And another strategy I often will have families practice, right? So those what ifs, you talked about the anxiety. Then the truth is there is going to be fear of allergic reactions and fear of potential death. There's just no way around that. That is appropriate to be afraid of. However, instead of ruminating and sort of spinning on worst case scenarios, I'll talk to families about switching their what if thoughts, those worried thoughts, to more action focused thoughts. So a what if thought to an if then thought. Well, what if my child has an allergic reaction out on that playground, or out at the play date, or out at lunch? Turns to, well, if they have an allergic reaction, then the staff that I've talked to, that we've trained, will use the emergency action plan, and epinephrine will be used, and they'll call 911 if they need to, right? They'll get the medical attention. And finally, another strategy that I talk about often is, and you sort of touched on it already, is widening the perspective. Again, we get very focused on the life-threatening qualities that food allergies can bring to the table, that fear of death, or even a fear of an allergic reaction that's severe, not death maybe, but just, again, having to go to the hospital or getting medical attention. That's not fun either. That is terrifying as well. And to help us sort of say, okay, yes, that is something we're going to be worried about and focus on. Let's widen the perspective to not just focus on worst case outcomes, which is where our mind is always going to want to go, but also to what is the best case outcome in this situation and what is the most likely outcome in this situation. So if we're going to think about worst case, and our mind will, right? Let's also think about some of the other outcomes that might be possible so that we aren't so afraid of trying new things and stepping outside of our comfort zone safely to live our lives, even with food allergies.
And those two pieces you've just shared, I loved. And they're the two parts that define anxiety, right? On the one hand, we develop anxiety when we have sort of worst case scenarios in our head, catastrophic outcomes. But the second part is that we often think we can't cope with whatever will happen, right? Yeah. And I love that two-pronged approach that you have with families, and I think we can apply it to anxiety in general. The if-then is brilliant. That is the coping. If this happens, then this is what I'll do. Or if this happens, this is how I'll cope. I think that is so helpful for families, but ourselves to really be able to sort of prepare ourselves, not let our minds determine everything when it comes to anxiety. When our fear is getting bigger, our view, like Chris always talks about, that sort of he uses his toilet roll. When our anxiety gets bigger, our vision gets
paper towel, actually, but that's all right.
You're right.
Very similar.
Same.
It's the toilet roll for little kids. It's the paper towel for adults.
I think you're probably right. The paper towel's more attractive. And sort of, our minds zoom in to worst case scenario. And by talking through the options, like what is the worst case, but what is the most realistic, we start to open up our perspective. And then working on that second piece around the if-then helps us to know that, even in these situations, then we can cope. I really love that.
It's sort of like it pulls us out of that stuck place and toward, I can cope, I can take action, or so it's brilliant.
So that's why when I'm working with families, and what's peppered throughout the book entirely is that anxiety, the goal is not to get rid of anxiety, right? Anxiety is an emotion we're all going to have. It's to get to know the anxiety, to manage the anxiety, and to help it to get to levels where it's not keeping you from living your life, right? It's manageable levels that then anxiety helps us to stay safe, prepare, plan, take action that keep us safe, but still allows us to live our lives. In the book, I refer to a researched principle called the Goldilocks principle. And it's sort of this just right level of anxiety, food allergy anxiety, and quality of life. It's we have to have some anxiety, and we will have some anxiety, but we don't want it to be so debilitating that we aren't willing to step outside of any comfort zone and function. And so again, getting to know anxiety, that it doesn't just exist because something's unsafe, that it's there because something's new. And the hardest part of all this is to practice and to do things, take actions that might make us anxious, but help us feel safer in the long run in living life with food allergies. That is probably some of the hardest work we do in this niche.
So it's that practicing being comfortable, being uncomfortable, right? It's like a muscle that will grow, but accepting that anxiety will never go, because anxiety has an important function for everybody in the world. Like, we are anxious animals, but particularly with food allergy, right? It's there for a reason. What kind of parent didn't have anxiety?
Yeah, it is. And I think to Chris's earlier point that I think both of you made this point, that we can rigidly believe every anxious thought we have about food allergies and use that to determine what we feel is safe and unsafe. And that's not a helpful practice to get into, although that's oftentimes where we might start off with, because we're so afraid of something happening to ourselves or our child, and that's understandable. So that's why it's really important to help determine what are our anxious thoughts and what are thoughts that are, really based in the necessity of that is unsafe and that isn't safe for me to do and I should avoid it, right? Are we avoiding things because we're anxious about it, or are we avoiding things because we medically need to? And that anxiety can really make it hard for us to determine that risk level and the safety of different experiences.
So the acceptance and commitment therapy that we're all familiar with, and many of our listeners are familiar with, we talk about diffusion exercises and other strategies for being able to cope in the moment when this stuff, bubbles up and begins to hijack our amygdalas and our thinking. Are there particular strategies that you like that you give to your clients that are helpful in these situations, from being able to sit with that stuff and still be oriented toward a valued living?
Yeah, I mean, I think I use some of the well-known stereotypical ACT practices like leaves on a stream or clouds in the sky, noticing our thoughts, but also being able to notice other thoughts that we have, right? I like to use, that big dark cloud, that scary dark cloud that might be carrying, that storm in it, isn't the only cloud we might see out there. What else about this eating out at a restaurant might you see? What other thoughts, what other outcomes, right? That widening the perspective. But another one I like to use is mental appreciation. Let's start by thanking our mind for trying to help keep ourselves or our child safe, right? That's its purpose, that's its function, that's what it's trying to do with our anxious thoughts. So thanking it and saying, I appreciate you trying, but you're also working a little too hard here. You're being, I term that as going from being a helpful friend to an unhelpful friend, right? Is our danger meter is a little too high here. Right. And so thanking our mind and starting from that place of sort of compassion, self-compassion for the anxiety and the anxious thoughts we have is also a good way to, in my opinion, to unhook from the very sticky thoughts and give us opportunity to widen that perspective to, okay, this might just be a thought, an anxious thought about safety versus a truth that this is unsafe.
I guess I'm just thinking sort of broader as well. When we have anxiety, sometimes it's hard to distinguish what is a reasonable, warranted anxious thought and what isn't. Do you have any tips on that?
Yeah. So, broadly speaking, things like checking a label a couple of times, maybe having a couple of set of eyes reading that label just to make sure, because things can get by us if we're in a hurry at the grocery store. So, maybe checking it at home as a second time just to make sure, versus the giving into the urge to check it repeatedly over and over and over and over again as a way to calm our anxious thought about, is this safe or is this not, right? That might be kind of a more common example. And then perhaps maybe another example of, noticing the thought that if a child wants to go to a sports event or something at school, right, the giving into the urge of the anxious thought of they can't be there and do that safely, so they just can't attend, versus saying, okay, how can they go safely? Maybe again, leaning into the problem solving line of thinking of what can we do to help make this safe so that that child can be included and connected with their peers, which is important for social health and developmental purposes. So perhaps maybe we problem solve by sending him with his own or her with her own snack, right? So it's noticing thoughts that tend to want to have us exclude and over avoid whole categories of life experiences because we're afraid, versus saying, okay, we're afraid, we're anxious about this. Can we do this safely? And again, I bring that back to having conversations with allergists and healthcare team to help determine what is safe enough, not safe, so that you have those markers to help you determine in any given situation, okay, we should be able to navigate this safely by doing X, Y, and Z, versus, okay, my mind is telling me there's no way to do this safely. That's because I'm anxious.
And I guess, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, courage really isn't the absence of fear. Like, this requires a lot of
Yeah,
courage for families and
It
and
does.
kids, right? To get more comfortable with the fear, the inevitable fear, because risk is there. No matter how much you control these conditions, there's always an inherent risk. And there's an inherent risk in life anyway, not just with food allergies. Like, we live with lots of risks. But like you said before we started the podcast, it's focusing on all that matters, not just safety, right? We all care about safety, obviously.
Right.
This is super important and to all of us. And obviously, safety is a little more complicated when you're navigating a food allergy. But being able to focus on all of it and starting to get more comfortable, and that courage, wow, I put myself in the shoes of parents, and it takes a lot of courage to say yes to go to a birthday party, or yes to go to a school trip, because the urge would be to control.
It really just starts with the willingness to do it. Quite honestly, it's unfortunately pretty easy to keep living in a way where we're over avoiding out of fear rather than medical necessity, because it feels safer, and we talk ourselves into believing that it is safer. And by and large, it is. I mean, right, we have less risk if we don't leave our house.
Of course.
It can't be 100% risk-free ever, but it's a lot less risk if we never leave our house. However, the counterpoint I make to that is, what's your quality of life? What's your child's quality of life? What's your family's quality of life? And as a family therapist, that's important for me to help people connect with, so that if they're choosing to over avoid things out of fear, that it's a choice that they're making instead of letting their anxious mind push them to do that. But again, there are ways to determine, is this an anxious thought I'm having? And this is fear, and fear will be part of that equation. And I'm prepared for that fear to be here, but to also take meaningful actions towards a better quality of life, or doing things that feel uncomfortable at first, like eating out, but doing them safely, so that we can eventually do them more often, and it feels less uncomfortable. We feel more comfortable doing those things versus just staying stuck in this, what we feel is a bubble of safety, but it's usually at the cost of our quality of life and that of our family.
We call those sort of safety behaviors, don't we, in our world? Is developing these behaviors that try to keep us safe, but inevitably we feel safer, but it backfires because it reinforces anxiety. And do you find, as you were describing this, I was wondering, do you find that the anxiety becomes contagious? Like, the parent then rubs off the anxiety onto the kids, and then kids start getting really anxious, which I imagine just makes everything more difficult.
It certainly can. It's not 100% given, nothing ever is, but it certainly can. And so it's important for parents to recognize their own anxiety. Again, we're going to have anxiety. We're going to feel anxious about this, but to be mindful of the language they use, the narratives that they use in front of their kids, even when they talk about that first allergic reaction story, right? Making sure to have conversations that are age appropriate based on their child's developmental stage and age, to make sure that if they are struggling to cope with the diagnosis and what I call adapt and adjust to living with food allergies, which includes a lot of acceptance. We talk about that a lot in ACT, right? Accepting the diagnosis. Don't have to like it, but do have to accept that this is what it is. If they're struggling with all of that, to get their own support and help, whether it's conversations with the allergist to help them get more facts and information so that they feel a little better about things and more equipped, practice skills, allergy management skills, so that they feel more confident and competent in responding to an allergic reaction, or getting support with a therapist to work through and learn coping strategies for their own anxiety and fear, and oftentimes guilt and sadness too.
What about in my working with families over the years? And when you work with kids, you never just work with the kids. You're working with the parents, you're working with teachers, and often you're working with grandparents. Do you find that sometimes you have to help the parents you're working with deal with extended family who may have, they may not take the food allergy thing very seriously? I mean, as we were talking before we started recording, when I was a child, all those, many decades and centuries ago, this just wasn't a thing. And so I would imagine that a lot of grandparents are kind of maybe poo-pooing these things or thinking that, the parents are overreacting. Does that show up in your work? I'm just curious.
Very much so. Yeah. It shows up in my work. It shows up in posts in the allergy community. These conversations about extended family come up all the time. And it's hard because, maybe it's a generational thing. It could also be a cultural thing as well, right? Again, food allergies were not as identified and discussed and known many decades ago as they are now. People weren't as aware. It feels like they weren't around, but they were. It's just we know more now and we're diagnosing more because we know more. Also, feeding food introduction protocols have changed for infants. And so science is evolving in this area as well. And so, yeah, these conversations are not always easy, oftentimes very hard because, again, it goes to a conflict, values conflict, right? We want to engage with our extended family, go to holiday gatherings, have grandma and grandpa over, have family and friends over, but we also need them to understand the safety protocols and use the safety protocols that are keeping ourselves, our family, our children safe. And so I'll have conversations with clients where we talk about, okay, are you guys a united front with grandma and grandpa, right? And who, conflict management, whose parents are these, who's having that conversation if you are going one-on-one with them. And the tough conversations where maybe you have to decide, our family members are not valuing our safety and our protection, especially in our own home. And so therefore we just can't invite them in anymore. Or we have to, have different visitation. Maybe it's outside of the home or we take our food there, different ways of interacting with family members. But these are very difficult conversations. And when it comes to, matters of the heart, love, people we love and relationships, these are very tough conversations to have sometimes. And hopefully, again, a lot of times it's families coming from a well-meaning place and they just don't know and understand. And hopefully in educating them, they will understand and help keep the child or the family safe. But sometimes it ends with, that's not the case. And then they're making some very tough decisions about relationships.
Yeah, very hard.
Very, very hard. Yeah. Yeah.
So, in the interest of time, final thoughts, final questions, Emma?
I was wondering, it's this last piece that you mentioned about navigating extended family. I was thinking, wow, there are so many skills that are required in living with a food allergy or being a parent of a child with food allergy. I mean, all these really challenging situations, you need to be really good with coping and managing your uncomfortable feelings of anxiety, guilt, responsibility. I mean, it's a territory for lots of learning and growth. So it sounds like a lot of help and support is needed.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned something really important, learning and growth. And oftentimes parents of kids with food allergies, we can kind of forget that piece. So experiences like family gatherings or holidays are good opportunities for not just ourselves, but to help our kids who have the food allergies learn and grow, right? Practice asking the right questions to assess safety, practice self-advocating for their safety, practice saying, no, thank you, I have my own food, or, no, I can't just have one bite, thank you. Practice navigating the world with their allergens around them safely, done safely, right? Whatever that is deemed by their healthcare team and them based on their set of allergies. But we may want to, through our anxiety, avoid all of those experiences because it just feels easier. I would again counter with, but how is that helping your child learn and grow and develop allergy management strategies and skills that they're going to need to keep themselves safe as they grow and launch into the world too? So yeah, these uncomfortable, hard experiences sometimes are the ones where we learn and grow the most. It's just getting ourselves to that place of willingness to say, okay, anxiety, anxious thoughts, I'm assessing safety. We've determined this is safe enough for us to do with these set of precautions and protocols in place. Now I got to do it. And I'm going to cope while I'm doing it because it's going to feel hard.
What I love about what you just said is that here's an opportunity for kids to actually learn some phenomenal life skills. It's not just about anxiety and allergy management. It's setting boundaries, is clarifying what truly matters, is prioritizing our well-being. These are so important to ourselves and kids anyway. That's
self-advocacy.
Self-efficacy. If we can teach our kids to do that, it's putting them on the right path to a rich and meaningful life.
And that is the crux of my book, May Contain Anxiety. It's helping families and parents be mindful of that piece, because we easily forget that in service of calming our own anxiety and overwhelm. But to remember that, we're trying to raise kids who not only meet normal developmental milestones and are growing up just in general, but are also learning how to navigate the world safely with food allergies and allergic conditions. And in order to do that, we have to allow them opportunities to practice skills and become competent and confident themselves.
Wonderful.
It's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really
so
hard.
They can enjoy life. So they can enjoy life and have a full and meaningful life as well. And we as families can too.
Yeah.
So I may not get this quote exactly right, particularly the back half, but I believe Mark Twain said, if you eat a live toad first thing every morning, the rest of the day will go fine. And I think, if these kids and these families can navigate all this stuff, learn all these skills, they're going to be unstoppable for the rest of their lives.
That's right.
Yeah. They'll accept the diagnosis, the food allergy diagnoses, and say, okay, and what's next?
Yeah. Bring it on.
But I just see beyond that, right? It's like how amazing to be 8 or 9 and be able to say to your extended family or to people that you don't know very well, no, thank you, I can't eat that. Like setting those boundaries and learning.
It's great for children life in general to be able to self-advocate and practice that, right? Like, especially if you're shy, that translates to when you're trying to get a job, when you're in a social situation and you're trying to make friends, right? Yeah, there's a lot of these skills that we and our kids can learn to navigate the world safely if we just are aware of our own anxiety and use strategies to manage and get the information we need to manage it appropriately. And when we practice all this stuff, it's not just helpful for living life safely and fully with food allergies, but also just living well in general.
And beyond. Yeah, absolutely.
And beyond. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you.
Well, that sounds like a good place to stop.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tamara. That was great. And again, the book can be pre-ordered on Amazon and other sites. So thank you for all your work. And this is fabulous. And again, we'll have links to your websites and various resources in the show notes. And if there's something that you think would be useful to have in the show notes in terms of resources, shoot us an email and we'll make sure that gets in there.
Thank you so much for having me and giving me an opportunity to talk about this very niche topic that touches us all. We all know someone with food allergies, even if it's not our own family, but to give this insight into what it's like to live with food allergies and to remind people that, we can live a full life and safe life with food allergies.
That's wonderful. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.